The Rekhi Foundation for Happiness was started in 2016 with the belief that happiness is a skill that can be learned and cultivated. In 2024, the foundation partnered with the world-renowned University of Waterloo to create a Center of Excellence for the Science of Happiness, one of over 70 such centers around the world. This video is from the March 2026 launch of the Rekhi-Environment Initiative, a collaboration with the Rekhi Foundation and the Faculty of Environment at Waterloo to explore happiness, well-being, and resilient communities in a sustainable world. The university invited Andrew Welch, author of The Value Crisis, to speak at this inaugural event. The topic of his engaging 45-minute presentation is The Value Crisis, a new paradigm to inform the science of happiness, sustainability, and community building.
Speaker in this position often begins with something about how it's an honor to be here and a real pleasure. In my particular case, that's even more so. I would really like to acknowledge the humongous support of Professor Simran Singh and Dr. Elham Mohammadi, without whom you could not imagine that I would be standing in front of you today. So I want to take you back, June 2023, I think, in this very room, the Rekhi Foundation had a speaker here by the name of Dr. Manas Kumar Mandel, who was delivering a really interesting talk about decoding the science of happiness. How many people were actually here and heard that talk or saw the video? 1, 2, 3. All right. I'm going to touch on that a fair amount. So you didn't miss, well, you missed a great video. Watch it, look it up. But I will incorporate some things from that talk as we go along, because I think it was a really interesting grounding and a really interesting opposite perspective. I think Dr. Mandel is everything that I am not in this field. He's a neuroscientist, Fulbright scholar and all those sorts of things. I come at things from a very different angle, and you'll see that. But a lot of the things we agreed on, one of the things is that happiness and the science of happiness is a very fuzzy concept. It's a very new concept, and there are more questions than answers. He made that really clear. And so the great thing about it is that it is still an exploratory science, not an explanatory science. So rather than, say, approaching an expert and they say, well, this is how happiness works, they say, we're trying to find out how happiness works, and maybe I'll have some questions for you about how happiness works. And exploratory is exactly what I do in this particular field. Now, that said, you're probably not going to be walking away at the end of the evening going, wow, I didn't know that about happiness. But what I will promise you is that you will be walking out of the room going, wow, I never thought about happiness that way before. So that's my goal. One of the things that Dr. Mandel talked about was how happiness, the science of happiness, it could either be an interdisciplinary approach or a transdisciplinary approach. So I thought we'd start with a fun slide. He talked about how the behavior scientists look into happiness feelings. What do people feel? Economists look at happiness choices. What utility gives us satisfaction? The neuroscientists, of course, are into happiness chemicals. Where is happiness in the brain? How can I plug in a probe that can detect happiness? While the AI scientists are looking for happiness clues in our face, muscles, and so on. How can a computer detect happiness? Because I could probably profit from that. Mathematicians, on the other hand, they have the happiness algorithms. How can we predict happiness potential? That's the one I'm going to sell to Amazon and Facebook. I want to know where people are looking on the screen and what makes them happy. Socioecologists are looking for the happiness triggers. And this is where it kind of blows up into a bigger picture, if you will. Can we be happy if the planet is not? So that's an interdisciplinary approach. It's supplying pieces of the puzzle. And everyone has their particular focus in their particular area, and they're all going to contribute in some big way. But what we're really looking at here is something completely different. What I would call the transdisciplinary approach. All right. So the Rekhi Foundation believes that it should be this approach, which implies new views, new things to measure, and in fact, a whole new vocabulary, potentially, about the science of science. And that's what I'm bringing to the table. That's why I'm here this evening, is I'm looking at new vocabulary in the science of happiness, new ways of framing things that I can put back on the scientists and the academics to say, oh, that's interesting. Maybe we could take a different approach to how we're looking at it ourselves. So my work is not specifically in happiness. As an ecological philosopher, I call myself, I study value systems and their impact on society and the planet. So let's explore how those two are connected. So Dr. Mandel talked about the science versus the art. So happiness science is really looking at what is happiness, how do we measure it, how can we predict it. The art of happiness is something quite different. That's how do we achieve happiness? Through mindfulness, through meditation, through various things. That's the art of happiness. How do we get there? The science of happiness takes a slightly different approach. So that's what we're going to be looking at. What does happy mean? Where is it? Happiness versus pleasure. Now that's very clear to the scientists that there is a very distinct difference. Pleasure is a pretty easy science. We know where it is in the brain. We can plug in a probe and detect pleasure. It's fairly short-lived. Whereas happiness is a much bigger, broader picture. It's a longer process. And in fact, we can have pleasure and not be happy. And we can be happy and not be experiencing pleasure. So two very different things, but people can easily get them confused. And we'll talk about that. That might come up again. Sustainability comes up in terms of the topic of what the Rekhi Foundation is all about and what I was here to talk about. And I thought it was interesting. One of the things I learned as a high school debater was always look up your terms, right? Go to the dictionary, check out what go to the very base level. And sustainability was interesting because the word sustain actually has two different meanings that tie into all of this. To continue over a period of time is one way of thinking of sustain, but also a means of holding something up, to give support to or relief to. Nourishment, like when somebody says, well, will that sustain you? They're not talking about a long period of time. They're talking about uplifting you with maybe the meal they just gave you. So sustainability, of course, we know in terms of that idea of something connected to resources, something that won't be depleted, something that can regenerate itself and keep humanity going for a while. And then, of course, community building. That's an interesting aspect. I don't want to get into a lot of it today, but I started to ask myself, because I work with numbers, community building is interesting, but how big is a community? So I started to read about civilizational collapse and how the problem is that civilization and communities got too big. And there's an interesting little aspect of research into that about how big a community should be. A fellow by the name of Robin Dunbar came up with this idea that if your community is about 150 people, that's about right. So if you're talking about community building as an objective through a foundation like this, an initiative like this, then you're probably thinking about something in that manageable size. That would be the community you want to look at. So here's a great connection between the Environment Initiative and the happiness connection to ecological economics. So it's a quote about well-being. It comes from a Canadian by the name of Mark Anielski, who has been kicking around in the ecological economics field for a while, although he kind of started off as an economist. He published a book called The Economics of Happiness. And so he gives us some hints of where we're going to be going with this talk. And as a side note, if happiness and well-being are essentially the same thing, if we put them together, does that allow the concept of happiness to cross over into other life forms? We know that well-being applies. You can look at a plant and know that its well-being is right, or whether I've had it for a while. So can we speak of a happy or unhappy raccoon or tree, or indeed, as I raised earlier, planet? So these are interesting questions when you get into the science of happiness. One of the things that Mark Anielski and Dr. Mandel both talked about was this idea of measuring happiness through something called a happiness index. He called it the Genuine Progress Index, which he got from, I think it was in 1996 in San Francisco, they came up with this idea. It's essentially a way of measuring happiness society-wide. So on a national scale, if you will. And we'll get back to that. And my arrival at this is through something called, as the talk suggests, a value crisis. So what is the value crisis? This is my graphical way of showing it. It's the idea that there are two different kinds of values that we measure success with as human beings. There's number-based values, and there are qualitative values. They're illustrated here to show that our society tends to put enormous emphasis on number-based values in terms of its operation and what gives us, what they give precedence to as a society. Values being the principles that we use to frame and measure happiness or success. So let's talk a little bit more about how those are actually defined. Number-based values I would list over here on the left. Money, obvious one. Possessions. Utilitarianism, which is a branch of philosophy which talks about the best choice is doing the greatest good. The greatest good being some kind of formula or measurement, a number-based. So it's certainly a number-based value. Votes, number-based. Whichever decision gets the more votes is considered the more valuable. Likes, followers, wealth indices, ownership, economic growth. Easy stuff here. Long list of qualitative human values. Now the difference is, there's a couple of differences. One is that you tend to see standard of living measured by the stuff on the left. You tend to see happiness and quality of life measured by the stuff on the right. You can't put numbers on the stuff on the right. You can't actually say that my spirituality is 17 this afternoon. But these things are important to us, and we know as humans that all of these things are important to us. And yet, what happens is that when we start to base everything on the stuff on the left, these start to get compromised. And I posit in my book from 2014 that this crisis comes from the disconnect between these two sides. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So, the idea about number-based values is to have certain properties. They're values that are measured quantitatively, obviously. They have the same properties as numbers, and this is key. They're linear. 5 is always greater than 3, it's always less than 7. And that order is set. It's the same for everyone, it's consistent. Everyone uses the same math to get there. And key to our discussion, numbers are limitless. You can always add another 0 or another 7. They just keep going. So what happens in a number-based value when the value is based on the number is that more is always worth more. If the value is being measured by the number, then a value of 17 is always worth more than 2 and is always less than 8,609,000. More is always better. That's a property of number-based values. And it's an unnatural value. We invented it. Why do I say that? Because there is nothing in the natural world where more is always better. It doesn't exist. And we'll talk more about why. But in the natural world, these do not apply. Never found an example of it. All right? So how does that apply to us? I came up with this idea that there are actually three kinds of wealth. Virtual wealth is based on the math. It's based on number-based values. We all recognize that. We all know what it means, okay? Has no direct biological relationship to us, other than the fact that money often helps when we get to the grocery store. And this is how it helps. It's where the overlap is between number-based values and qualitative values. So the one in the middle there is real wealth. And you could think, yeah, I could put a dollar value on real wealth. That's where the numbers aspect comes in. But it actually has specific relevance to us as natural living creatures. And also, it has tangible objects involved. All right? So that real wealth is stuff, food, shelter. Now, there's an interesting incompatibility with these two that was discovered by this man, Frederick Soddy, who's a radiochemist. Wow. What the heck's radiochemistry got to do with this? This is really cool because this is kind of the aspect of where ecological economics is going. This is what Professor Simon Singh does a lot of, is taking rules that don't normally apply to this field and seeing where they fit in. He was talking about the rules of thermodynamics and applying those to virtual wealth and real wealth. And what he basically said was, you know, real wealth over time is subject to entropy. That food will eventually degrade. The car will eventually rust. Everything will eventually break down. That's the way the natural world works. Everything is subject to the laws of thermodynamics. Money? Wait a minute. No, it doesn't do that. Money tends to go up. How is it fair that in an exchange, I give someone money, they give me food, my value goes down over time, their value goes up over time? So he wrote a book about that, about the relationship between these values in the thermodynamic sense. So what Mark Anielski talks about a lot in terms of the Genuine Progress Index that we talked about earlier is this concept called genuine wealth. Genuine wealth is the list that we have on the right. It's joy, beauty, happiness, justice, freedom, all of those things that cannot be measured but have real meaning to us, qualitative values. And so, me being me in an exploratory science and me coming from a math background, I thought, well, I know how you can graph virtual wealth and I know how you can graph real wealth. How do you graph genuine wealth? Is it possible? And I think it is. And I say it looks like that. Okay. Interesting, that's the new logo for Meta now, right? It's also the logo for Canadian Blood Services. This is gaining some real traction here. So I say we can graph it that way because I know that graphically, we know for something like freedom, we know where we're succeeding and we know where we're failing, right? Relatively speaking, we can compare as humans two situations and we know whether there's freedom more or freedom less. But how do you move from one area of freedom to another? Well, that depends where you're starting from. So if you're kind of struggling with an authoritarian regime that controls every aspect of your life, then freedom is achieved by relaxing that structure and control. That's how you achieve freedom in that kind of starting place. But what happens if you have too much relaxation of control and structure? Then you start getting lawless anarchy. Oh, we don't want that. I mean, we want freedom, but we don't want everyone just doing whatever they feel like it and infringing on other people's freedom. So in order to solve this lawless anarchy, we try and introduce some basic rules, right? Some common ground rules. If we introduce too many of those, we have our authoritarian bureaucracy. So you see what's happening here. We really have two poles. We have authority on the one side and autonomy on the other. And it constantly dances between these two. This is a very natural process, a very natural way of thinking of things. You are doing it right now with your breathing. Inhale, exhale. Not enough oxygen, whoa, inhale, whoa. Too much carbon dioxide, go over there, breathe out, whoa, not enough oxygen, take it in again. You will never have the perfect balance of gases in your system at any one time. You are always moving through this framework, which is called a polarity, two poles. And so My gift to this particular field is a suggestion that all qualitative values exist as polarities. They all have this idea of two opposites that we move between. This is the way the natural world works. And I can apply that to anything. I can apply it to art. I can apply it to justice. I can apply it to beauty. I can apply it to joy and happiness, which we'll get to. Here's just life itself, right? You recognize these things. This basically defines sustainability, this ability to move back and forth. And the twist is important. A lot of models talk about life being circular and economies being circular. That twist in the circle is important because it shows why we move around the circle. We always want to go to the happier upper part. And life gives us feedback and takes us back down. And whoa, we don't want that. We want to go to the other side. So that provides the impulse for us to continue moving in that sense. So how do we apply that to happiness? Let's see what happens. That's a simple way of looking at it. Happiness might be a polarity between activity and rest. When we're active, we're engaged, but if we're too engaged, we get burnout. So we decide we're going to re-energize and relax for a bit, take it easy, and then we get bored. Simple enough. So the thing about this circle actually working is what I suggested earlier about feedback. It's a very important concept of sufficiency. Sufficiency is both a minimum and a maximum. All right? So, if we don't have enough food, we're insufficient food. We're hungry, we're not happy. As we move up the curve, we get sufficient food, great, we're happy. We can eat our meal. But when we've eaten our meal, we're done. And we don't want any more. So sufficiency in that sense is I have had sufficient. I would be unhappy if I tried to eat a second meal. We go down the curve on the other side. And I suggest that both minimum and maximum sufficiency are keys to happiness at some point. Because we know that there's happiness above the bottom line and below the top line. So let me put that in a sense that economists think about. This is one of my favorite slides. It's one of the first things I kind of came up with as an anecdote. We have a lot of snow out there at the moment, and if you don't have a snow shovel, you're in trouble. So the value you would place on getting a snow shovel is pretty high so that you can clear your walk. However, you start adding snow shovels, this is what I call marginal value. I like to have a second snow shovel. It allows me to have a friend help me out. Also, I can kind of snowplow down the driveway and have two snow shovels going. I like that. But if I added a third or a fourth or a fifth, I would start getting cluttered up in my hallway, right? I would not be happy. Marginal value is this concept that the number of objects you start with determines your value that you assign to each additional object. I have a little separate slide on that, so we'll look at it more. But as I add more objects, my marginal value drops significantly. So, there's my curve for my genuine value. It has a sufficiency point, right? Right at the top there, that's the peak. I do not want more than 4 shovels, absolutely not. However, if you are a shovel salesperson, this is what the graph looks like, right? That's a number-based value. If I sell 100 shovels, that's better than selling 10. If I sell 1,000 shovels, that's better than selling 100. And this one, being a number-based value, is limitless. More is always better. So now you can start seeing some of the problems that we're going to run into in ecological economics. Quick review of that marginal value. It's a human thing. It's based on the number we already have. It's the same as snow shovels, dollars, liters of water. That's why rich people struggle with this. Because if you've got $1 billion, the next 100 is not really going to do much for you. It doesn't give you much satisfaction. The marginal value is really low. If I'm starting at 1 billion, I need 6 billion in order to get that same hit, right? That's marginal value. So it's innately human. Genuine value, we talked about all of that. So here's an interesting paradox that I thought I'd throw at you because it occurred to me. I thought, what can they challenge me with? I thought somebody's going to stick their hand up at the end of the talk and say, so more is always better. You say that's not really a valid way of going through life. But what about happiness? Isn't more happiness always better? Okay, I should really come up with a response to that. So I did come up with a response. I thought that if better means happier, then it's a meaningless question, right? Is better always better? Yeah. So it becomes a tautology and it's not really a useful thing. But when you say, what happens if we try and implement more happiness? Is that always better? And what I'm thinking of now is if you have a child at home, which is a happy child, right? And is happy with a stick playing in the mud puddle, and you think, I'm going to make this child happier by giving it more toys and more things to play with because I want the child to be constantly smiling and happy. What you're creating potentially is more pleasure, but it doesn't last as long, does it? And a child who grew up with an imagination and a stick in the puddle is probably going to be a better formed human than the child that ends up with a room full of toys that they don't play with anymore and are looking for the next dopamine hit, right? So I can argue that trying to implement more happiness can actually work against it. Then there's hedonic adaptation. That's the idea where people quickly adapt to the level of pleasure that's around them and to the point where it no longer gives them happiness and they're seeking the next hit. We see a lot of that going on too. So more happiness is not always better because these people are actually unhappy when they adapt to the level they're at. And what we're about to talk about, what about happy people and not a happy planet? If we're focused on happy people and we think that we can make people happier by giving them new technology and new toys, what does that do for the environment in which they live in? So there's our planet. Kate Raworth in 2012 came up with this really interesting model for how we measure economics. She said that there's an ecological ceiling to our activities on the planet, and if we exceed those, we're in trouble. She calls it ecological overshoot, a term that's much more commonly heard these days, and there's a list of the things that can cause overshoot. But she called it the donut model because it looks like a donut, obviously. She says there's an inner circle that is the social foundation. And that has things like education, water, food, health. And if we don't have enough of those, we've got a shortfall, sociological shortfall. So the idea of her economic model is to get into that sweet spot in the middle, which she called the safe and just space for humanity. Does this trigger anything from a slide we saw just a couple of slides ago? Sufficiency? Interesting that the overshoot is all involved with too much, going past sufficiency. The shortfall is insufficient, not having enough. So what I proposed in my book was that this is really a values crisis. Because when you use numeric, number-based values, you start getting overshoot. There is no limit. There's no sense of sufficiency. That's what causes overshoot. And if you look down that list, geez, does more always better correspond to the causes of climate change, freshwater withdrawals, air pollution, ozone layer? Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm not in any way questioning this. I'm giving a different framework that's below the level of, in fact, what the donut model talks about. The donut model actually graphs a lot of goals, but implementing it starts to look a bit like a polarity, doesn't it? You want happy people, you deal with their social concerns. But if your idea of happy people is giving them bigger houses and consuming more clothing and fashion, etc., you start heading into overshoot. You go, oh, no, let's go for a happy planet. You go for a happy planet, and then the ecological concerns are looked after, but of course, you might not be able to provide the same kind of health care that you did before. So you back up and you go, let's try and get back to happy people. So this is, I think, in a sense, polarity. So this more is always better is, in fact, how the GDP works, gross domestic product. And people recognized a long time ago that that wasn't working for people. More is always better does not work, because it's not taking into account all kinds of other things that are really important to us as humans. So I mentioned in 1996 that gross genuine progress index was developed in San Francisco. In 2008, they developed this idea of gross national happiness in the Kingdom of Bhutan. They actually adopted it as a governance policy, as a structure. They weren't going to measure GDP anymore. They were going to start measuring national success based on these principles. Look at that. Psychological well-being, health, time use, education. Dr. Mandel mentioned in his talk that about 156 countries have adopted some form of genuine progress index to measure their happiness. Well, that's great. But I'm afraid they are not using that as a governance tool. They're using it as a, hey, where do we rank? Oh, no, we went from 7th to 14th. But are they making decisions based on something like that? I don't think so. You read the book that was mentioned by Dr. Brown on Mark Carney's values. Yeah, he talks a good talk about, how important these values are. But frankly, he's an international banker. And at the end of the day, while he respects those values, if push comes to shove, he's going to go to the gross domestic product. And why? Not because he is a hypocritical person. It's because he has to face the realities that we all have to face, which was mentioned earlier too by Dr. Myers. Jobs, right? People have to have jobs. People have to have income. That's the way the world works. And if you're putting forward something like this is a great tool in Bhutan, but Bhutan is struggling in many ways. And so it's struggling because it's trying to work with a framework that the rest of the planet doesn't seem to be using. And that can create problems. Okay. Don't want to get into a lot of this just in the time I've got left, but this is some things to think about. Maybe these will trigger some questions in the Q&A or in the discussion afterwards, because we have the room till midnight, right, Simran? Some of the tyranny of mathematics that I've been encountering when I started doing this work, this idea of exponential growth. There was a professor in the US, Albert. He basically said the greatest shortcoming in the human race is the inability to grasp the exponential function. Numbers work by exponents. Growth. You use the word growth. The mathematical definition of growth is any constant growth will be exponential. That's a given. No matter how constantly flat it is at 1.5%, that has a doubling rate, and then a doubling rate, and then a doubling rate. Defies the laws of thermodynamics. We talked about that. Jevons paradox. Jevons paradox is this economic idea that if you make something more efficient, you can use less of the resource, and it turns out you don't. You use more of the resource because it's more efficient. So, hey, cool, we'll use more. Democracy is actually part of the tyranny of mathematics, right? Just because if I'm running a meeting and 7 people vote for something and 2 people vote against it, does that mean that the idea they voted for is better? No, popularity contest. I want to know, as a facilitator, and I often do this, what do those 2 people know that the other 7 don't? Right? So democracy is basically a popularity contest, and we are not guaranteed of being happier or having the better outcome just based on numbers. Statistics, oh, don't get me started. The impersonal abstraction of being a number. The idea of infinity. Whereas the fickleness of humanity on the other side, remember that marginal value, that's different for everyone. How can you say how much a snow shovel is worth in terms of utility? Because everybody has a different idea of how much that snow shovel is worth to them, partly in that sense of how many they already have. We have irrational biases. Ooh, that's difficult math, isn't it? We're humans. We choose different things to make us happy. Ooh, that's awkward. Hedonic adaptation, we mentioned earlier, interconnectedness. The whole world that we live in has a complexity that we cannot begin to fathom. And so that makes things really difficult as humans to try and come up with mathematical laws in our particular study of neuroscience or behavioral science or whatever it is. And the inability to quantify the stuff that really counts is going to create problems as well. Turns out that the values that I talk about as a values crisis are a polarity. When you've got numbers-based, you've got, oh, good, growing economy, rational thoughts. Rational thoughts. At one point, humanity decided in the Renaissance, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And science moved forward really well based on that, because we got rid of a whole lot of stuff that we didn't think was good science. Everything, for instance, that was happening for tens of thousands of years in North America with indigenous populations, couldn't measure that stuff either. Can't measure happiness, can't measure joy. Uh-oh. That leads to unsustainability and social inequity. So, whoa, we fire over there into the greater well-being and genuine wealth idea and qualitative values. That's good. Qualitative values are good, except that when we only have qualitative values, we're kind of less affluent, we don't have all the toys that we used to have. The decisions are way tougher. Maybe if we just introduce some science and some rationality into it, away we go. This is what makes us humans. This is what makes it life worth living, right? Okay, just coming up to the end here. I will tell you something. This model, I called it a polarity. There was a book, Barry Johnson came out with it, I think in, I'm going to say 1976, something like that, called Polarity Management. And he was using this idea for businesses. He said, polarities are problems that do not have a single solution. So you want to improve business productivity, it's going to be a polarity of some kind. More creativity is on the one side, more individualism, more teamwork is on the other, and you bounce between the two. And so we can borrow from that field some interesting rules. And one of the things he discovered when he researched polarity management is, hey, Andrew, why don't we just stick with one side? Why don't we just take the good and the bad of number-based values and be done with it? What his findings were is that you stick to one side, you'll get the bad side of both. So if we only had number-based values, we don't not only have the unsustainability and the social inequity, but we'd also end up with less affluence and tougher decisions. And you think about that, you think about how because we're number-based and our economy and our rules and our politics are number-based, who's running the show? The guys with the billions coming on trillions. And we actually have less affluence because it's all going up to the top. We're all struggling to do more and more with less and less. So it seems to apply. So let's summarize some of what we've talked about. We talked about this idea of sufficiency and happiness being related. I don't think you could talk about one without the other. And if you can only talk about happiness in terms of sufficiency, that means that tells you right there why Dr. Mandel brought it up in his talk, that study that Daniel Kahneman got his Nobel Prize for. He noticed that people were happier, hit an income of 75,000 as they made more and more. About 75,000, it leveled off, it plateaued. They did not get happier when they made more. In fact, some of them became unhappier the more they made. Because there's this idea of sufficiency. Important to really grasp the paradigm shifts that we have to look at. What I've unrolled with the donut model, etc., is some pretty profound changes that the planet would have to look at in terms of producing a happy planet. And can we be happy without a happy planet? I don't think so. But that's for the ecological economists to prove. Qualitative values as polarities is something a little different. Again, we're talking about incompatibility with natural values, the way we make our decisions. And I want to close with this one final model or a conundrum that I call the value change conundrum. Okay, Andrew, I'm convinced we're spending far too much time with number-based values. Why don't we just switch over and start giving equal precedence to qualitative values so that we'll be happier? Here's the problem. They are a polarity. They are opposites. What is good here is bad over here. So you will not change your value system. You will not make that effort as a human until you see the point. And you won't see the point until you've changed your value system. Right? So for you to say, you know what, I'm going to change out of a number-based value system and I'm going to go with green technology and I'm going to have a better life balance. But coming where I come from, how can green technology really have an economic benefit? How can we make money on this solar panel stuff? They're stuck. They're stuck. The idea is what if you lost money? Oh, I can't do that. Show me how I can use qualitative values to run my life, but still have my bank balance. This is the conundrum, right? Albert Einstein said no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. I say no value system can be solved from the same value system that created it. That's my take on that. So, Friday, March 20th, 2 weeks from now, International Happiness Day. Enjoy that. That's a UN resolution, by the way, in 2012. We made that happen. So we have to obey it because we do follow the UN, right? We answer to their instructions. These are the two books that were mentioned in the introduction. I only bring these up to say that on the way here this morning, I dropped in on 2 bookstores. I thought, I'm going to take advantage of this a bit. I'm going to say, I'm giving a talk tonight at the University of Waterloo. I'm not going to take books to that talk. So I would like to be able to say, here are where you could pick up copies of those books if you wanted. Local business, why not? Qualitative economy. Wordsworth Books in Waterloo and Magic Pebble Books in Elora is where you can do that. And at that, I thank you so much for your kind attention, and we can get into some questions and answers.